There is a moment in the silence between stars when even an immortal species begins to understand endings.
Wesser von Keth had lived for 912 years. He had watched empires rise from dust and crumble back into it. He had seen sons die. He had held the hands of friends as they passed into whatever waited beyond consciousness, and he had felt the peculiar weight of being the one who remained. The Tessari Dominion had existed for 11,000 years before his birth. 11,000 years of expansion, of learning, of building monuments across 1,000 star systems that would last until the heat death of the universe itself. They had transcended war. They had conquered disease, aging, scarcity. They had become, in their own estimation, eternal. They had been wrong. Thesser stood now at the observation deck of the Morning Crown, flagship of what remained of the Tessari Third Fleet, and watched the stars through the reinforced crystalline viewport. Once, those stars had represented opportunity, possibility, the infinite canvas upon which his people would paint their legacy. Now, they represented the direction from which death would come. Admiral. He did not turn at the sound of the voice. He knew it belonged to Severus, his tactical adjutant, a young woman of only 400 years who had never known anything but peace until 6 months ago. "The Council has confirmed it," she continued, her voice carrying the particular flatness that came from speaking words too terrible to inflect with emotion. "Teshar Prime has fallen. The Harrow broadcast the confirmation 2 hours ago." Thessar closed his eyes. Tessar Prime, the cradle world, the birthplace of his species, where the first Tessari had looked up at the night sky and wondered if they were alone, where the great libraries held the accumulated wisdom of 11 millennia, where 3 billion souls had lived in a paradise that had taken 100 generations to perfect. Gone. Casualties? He asked, though he knew the answer. Total. He had known. Of course he had known. The Harrow did not leave survivors. They did not negotiate. They did not conquer for resources or territory or ideology. They simply consumed. And when they were finished consuming, they broadcast their victories across every communication frequency in the galaxy, ensuring that every species who might think to resist would understand the futility of resistance. "That makes 17 core worlds," Thesser said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Hollow. 43 colonies. How many dead, Severus, in total? The current estimate is 8.3 billion Tessari. He opened his eyes and looked at his reflection in the viewport. An old man's face stared back at him, silver-blue skin marked with the ceremonial patterns of his rank, eyes that had once held the certainty of a species that believed itself destined to inherit the cosmos. Now those eyes held only exhaustion and something worse. Hope dying. "We have 700 ships remaining," Severus said. "The Council believes we can protect Thessa Minor for another 3 months if we consolidate our forces, perhaps 4 if the humans agree to shelter our civilian populations." Thessar turned at that. "The humans?" "They are the only species the Harrow has not attacked. Their territory remains untouched. The Council believes—" She hesitated, and for the first time emotion crept into her voice, something that sounded almost like shame. "The Council believes we should petition them for sanctuary." "The humans?" Thessar remembered when his people had first encountered humanity 800 years ago. A young species, barely out of their atmospheric age, still bound to a single blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. The Thessary Scientific Council had studied them with the detached interest one might show a particularly clever species of insect. They had noted humanity's propensity for violence, their fractured governance, their wasteful exploitation of resources.
The recommendation had been clear: quarantine the system, allow natural development, check again in 1,000 years to see if they had evolved past their primitive tendencies or destroyed themselves.
Most species did destroy themselves, after all. It was the great filter that separated the transient from the eternal. The Thessary had passed that filter. Humanity, they had been certain, would not. And yet, here they were, 800 years later, and it was the Thessary who faced extinction, while humanity spread quietly across their modest territory, building their unremarkable stations, crewing their functional ships, existing in that strange, subdued way that had always made Thessar uncomfortable. They had never tried to join the galactic concord. They had never sought alliances or trade agreements with the elder races. They simply watched, waited, built their little civilization in their little corner of the galaxy, and said nothing when the great powers made their great decisions. Thessar had always found it unsettling. A species that powerful, and they were powerful in their crude industrial way, should want something, should demand something. The fact that they didn't suggested either profound wisdom or profound patience, and he had never been able to determine which. "Set course for Saul," he said. "I will speak to them myself." The journey took 4 days. 4 days of receiving reports from the front lines. 4 days of watching the Harrow's broadcast network pulse with new victory announcements. Thessar Secondary, the Vaughn shipyards, the refugee fleet that had been carrying 200 million civilians toward what they had believed was safety. The Harrow did not simply announce their victories, they celebrated them. Their transmissions were filled with visual records of destruction, of worlds burning, of fleets dissolving into debris fields that would orbit dead stars for eternity. They wanted the galaxy to see. They wanted every species to understand that resistance was not merely futile, but foolish, that the only rational response to the Harrow was acceptance. Many species had accepted. The Thessary had tried to fight, and they had lost everything. On the 4th day, Thessar stood on the bridge of the Morning Crown as it emerged from hyperspace on the edge of the Sol system, and he got his first close look at humanity's home territory in 800 years. It was unremarkable. He had expected grandeur, monuments, the ostentatious display of power that every elder race projected to establish dominance. Instead, he saw functional stations in stable orbits, designed for efficiency rather than beauty, cargo vessels moving in orderly patterns, defense platforms positioned with geometric precision, their weapon systems neither brandished nor hidden. And ships. Thousands of ships, most of them small, most of them of designs he didn't recognize. They moved through the system like blood cells through a circulatory system, each one performing a task that was presumably meaningful, but entirely opaque to outside observation. "Admiral," the communications officer said, "we are being hailed. On screen." The face that appeared was human, female. Middle-aged by their short-lived standards, with gray threading through dark hair and lines around her eyes that suggested either great hardship or great wisdom, perhaps both. "Thessary vessel," she said, and her voice was calm in a way that Thessar found oddly jarring. Not the artificial calm of diplomatic training, but something deeper, the calm of someone who had no need to prove anything. "I am Captain Amara Okonkwo of the United Earth Naval Service. You've entered human territorial space. Please state your intentions." Thessar hesitated.
He had prepared a speech, a formal petition drafted by the Council's finest diplomatic minds, designed to appeal to humanity's rumored sense of compassion while maintaining the dignity of the Tesserae people. But looking at this woman's face, at the quiet patience in her eyes, the words suddenly seemed inadequate.
"We are dying," he said instead. "We are being destroyed, and we have nowhere else to go." The human woman's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes, something that might have been recognition. "Admiral von Keth," she said, and he was startled that she knew his name. "You're the commander of the Third Fleet, the one that held the line at Teshar Secondary for 18 hours after it should have fallen." "You know of that battle?"
We watch everything. She paused. Your people are welcome in human space. We've prepared facilities at Titan Station for civilian processing. Military assets will be directed to coordinates we're transmitting now. You'll receive housing, medical care, and food for as long as you need it.
Thesser felt something strange move through his chest. Relief, perhaps, or grief. It was difficult to separate them anymore.
"You do not wish to discuss terms, conditions?"
No.
"You do not want something from us in exchange?" The human captain's expression shifted, and for a moment, Thesser saw something behind her calm facade, something that looked almost like sorrow. "Admiral," she said, "your people are dying. What would we demand from the dying except that they survive?" Titan Station was larger than Thesser had expected. Not larger in the way that Tesserae installations were large, vast and ornate, designed to inspire awe, but larger in a functional, practical way that seems to have been built with refugee populations specifically in mind. Modular sections connected by covered walkways, atmospheric processors that could be calibrated for dozens of different species. Medical bays equipped with technology that Thesser didn't recognize, but which his advisors assured him was at least a generation beyond what humanity should possess. He walked through the refugee processing center now, watching his people shuffle forward in lines that moved with surprising efficiency. Tesserae families, children who had never known fear, elders who had never imagined that their civilization could end. All of them broken, all of them lost, all of them carrying the weight of everything they had been forced to leave behind. Admiral von Keth. He turned. A human man stood behind him, tall and thin, with a calm expression and patient eyes. He wore a simple uniform without rank insignia or decorations. "I am Marcus Chen. I've been assigned as your liaison during your stay. Is there anything you need?" Thesser studied the man for a long moment. There was nothing threatening about him, nothing impressive. He was simply present, in a way that suggested he would remain present for as long as necessary. "I need to understand something," Thesser said. "Of course." The Harrow has been broadcasting their victories across the galaxy for months. They have destroyed 17 Tesserae worlds and 43 colonies. They have killed billions. Every species in the galactic concord has either surrendered or retreated to their core systems, hoping to delay the inevitable. He paused, watching Marcus Chen's face for any reaction. There was none. "But they have not touched human space," Thesser continued. "Not one station, not one ship, not one life. Why?" Marcus Chen's expression remained calm. "I'm not authorized to discuss military strategy, Admiral. I am not asking about strategy. I am asking why the most aggressive force the galaxy has seen in 10,000 years has chosen to avoid the species that every elder race once dismissed as primitive savages barely worth observing. Something shifted in the human's eyes, something that looked almost like amusement, though it was gone before Thesser could be certain. Perhaps, Marcus Chen said, they know something the elder races didn't. And what would that be? The human was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, and his calm seemed deeper, less a mask than a foundation. Admiral, how much do you know about human history? Thesser frowned. I know the summary reports. Your species spent most of its existence at war with itself. Your world was ravaged by conflict, disease, environmental collapse. You came close to extinction at least 4 times before you achieved interstellar travel. By all projections, you should not exist. And yet here we are.
Yes, here you are.
Marcus Chen smiled, and it was the first genuine expression Thesser had seen from him. Admiral, my great-grandmother survived something called the Pacific Collapse, an environmental disaster that killed 200 million people and destabilized half of Earth's governments. When she was dying, she told me something I never forgot. He paused. She said that humanity's greatest weakness has always been our ability to destroy ourselves. But our greatest strength is that we never stop trying to survive anyway. No matter what, no matter the cost, we adapt, we endure, we become whatever we need to become to make it through to the next day. Thesser felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the station's temperature. You are saying that your species is accustomed to catastrophe. I'm saying that for humanity, Admiral, catastrophe is not the exception, it is the context. We have been preparing for the end of everything since before we knew the stars were suns. Not because we want to fight, not because we love war, but because we understood from the very beginning of our consciousness that the universe does not care whether we survive. He met Thesser's eyes, and for the first time, the Tessari Admiral saw something in the human's gaze that he had never expected to find in such a young species. Depth. Ancient, terrible depth. So we decided to make it care. The days passed, then weeks. Thesser watched his people settle into the rhythms of refugee life. The children began to play again, eventually. The adults began to work. Humanity provided meaningful tasks for those who wanted them, understanding somehow that idle hands led to idle minds, and idle minds led to despair. The elders began to teach, passing on the stories and traditions of a civilization that existed now only in memory. And the humans continued to be strange. They were polite, always polite. They asked questions about Tessari culture with what seemed like genuine curiosity. They adjusted their facilities to accommodate Tessari needs without being asked. They mourned with the refugees when news came of new hero victories, offering condolences that felt sincere rather than performative. But they never talked about themselves, not really. When Thesser asked about their military capabilities, they changed the subject. When he asked about their government's response to the hero threat, they spoke in generalities. When he asked what they intended to do, they simply said, "We're watching." Always watching. It was maddening. It was terrifying. It was, Thesser began to realize, entirely deliberate. The turning point came 6 weeks after his arrival. He was in his quarters, comfortable, private, designed with Tasari aesthetics in mind, when his communication terminal activated with an incoming message. The sender identification was blank.
Admiral von Keth. The voice was human, female, unfamiliar. Please come to observation deck 7, alone.
He should have refused. He should have reported the irregular contact to his security personnel. Instead, he found himself walking through the station's corridors at midnight, following a route that seemed to bypass all the usual checkpoints until he stood at a viewport overlooking the vast expanse of Saturn's rings.
Captain Amara Okonkwo was waiting for him.
Admiral, she said, thank you for coming. I was not aware you were on the station. I arrived this afternoon. Quietly, she turned to look at him, and in the dim light of the observation deck, her face looked older than it had on the view screen, more weary. I need to show you something. Something that I am not technically authorized to share, but I think you need to see it.
Why?
Because the Harrow just broadcast their latest victory. And I think you deserve to know why we haven't responded yet. She touched a control on her wrist, and the viewport became a display screen. What appeared on it made Thessa's breath stop. A world. Green and blue. Beautiful in the way that only living planets could be beautiful. But as he watched, that beauty was transformed into horror. The Harrow's vessels descended on the planet like locusts, and what followed was the systematic annihilation of everything. Cities, forests, oceans, life.
The transmission was accompanied by audio, a voice speaking in the synthetic language the Harrow used for their broadcasts. Another species has learned the truth. Another civilization has accepted their role in the Great Consumption. Their resistance was noted. Their suffering was observed. Their end was inevitable. Watch, observe, understand. This is what awaits all who stand before the Harrow.
The broadcast ended with coordinates, a challenge, an invitation for the next species to either submit or be destroyed.
Thesser realized his hands were trembling.
That was the Keth homeworld, he said. The last major Tasari settlement outside human space. 800 million people.
I know. The Harrow has now eliminated 93% of my species. His voice broke. We are functionally extinct. We have enough genetic material for recovery, perhaps, if we are given thousands of years and resources we no longer possess. But the Tasari as a civilization, as a culture, as a people who matter in this galaxy, we are finished.
Captain Okonkwo said nothing.
And you have done nothing, Thesser continued, and he was surprised to find that what he felt was not anger, but grief. You have watched. You have welcomed our refugees, you have been kind and patient and generous, but you have done nothing to stop them.
No, the captain said. We haven't.
Why? She turned back to the viewport, which had returned to showing the rings of Saturn in all their silent majesty.
Admiral, what do you know about human military doctrine?
Very little. Your people do not share such information.
No, we don't. She paused. Let me tell you a story. 500 years ago on Earth, there was a conflict called the Sino-American War. It lasted 3 days. Both sides had weapons capable of ending human civilization. Both sides knew that using those weapons would result in mutual annihilation. And yet they fought anyway, because both sides believed, truly believed, that they could win if they were willing to sacrifice enough.
What happened?
They were both wrong. The war ended only because the weapons malfunctioned, a software error that prevented the final exchange, an accident. Humanity survived its greatest test, not through wisdom or restraint, but through random chance. She looked at him, and her eyes held something that made Thesser feel very, very small. We learned from that. We learned that the universe does not care about our survival, and we cannot trust ourselves to make rational decisions under pressure. So we built something different. We built a system that would make decisions for us when we couldn't be trusted. A system that would watch and wait and analyze. A system that would not act until the optimal moment.
I do not understand.
Admiral, every species in the galaxy responded to the Harrow immediately. They mobilized their fleets, they fortified their positions, they fought back with everything they had as fast as they could, because that is what instinct demanded. And the Harrow destroyed them, because the Harrow was designed to exploit exactly that kind of response. They are not conquerors, they are predators. And predators succeed by triggering panic and exploiting the mistakes that panic creates. She reached out and touched the viewport, her fingers leaving faint impressions on the crystalline surface. Humanity has not responded, because humanity is waiting. Waiting for what? Captain Okonkwo smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was not a cruel smile either. It was the smile of someone who understood something so fundamental about the universe that words were almost insufficient to express it. For them to broadcast their victory. The next 3 weeks were the longest of Thesser's life. He watched the Harrow's broadcasts with the same morbid attention he had given them for months. But now, watching felt different. Now there was context. Now every transmission from the Harrow felt less like a funeral announcement and more like evidence. He began to notice patterns he had missed before. The Harrow attacked species that had responded with immediate aggression. They targeted civilizations that had mobilized their defenses, their patterns visible across communication networks. They seemed to know exactly where every fleet was, exactly when every defense would be weakest. They were not just predators. They were listeners, observers. They harvested the galaxy's own communications and used that information to optimize their consumption. And humanity. Humanity was silent. Oh, there was activity. Thesser saw it now that he knew to look. Ships moving in patterns that seemed random but carried a deeper logic. Stations going dark and then reactivating in new positions. Communications that were encrypted, compressed, hidden beneath layers of noise that made them invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. Humanity was preparing. But preparing for what? The answer came on the 49th day of his stay, when the Harrow made their final broadcast. It began like all the others. Victory announcements, casualty figures, the coordinates of their next target. But this time, the target was different. This time, the target was Earth. Thessar was in the refugee center when the broadcast came through. Around him, Tasari refugees stopped what they were doing and turned to look at the display screens that had activated throughout the facility. The Harrow's synthetic voice echoed through the corridors. The last significant resistance in this sector has been eliminated. The primitive species known as humanity has been observed. Their silence has been noted. Their inaction has been calculated. They are weak. They are afraid. They will be consumed. The broadcast displayed the Harrow fleet's trajectory, 12,000 vessels, enough firepower to sterilize a dozen worlds, approaching the Sol system at velocities that would bring them within striking range in 72 hours. This is our victory. This is our moment. Watch, observe, understand. Humanity ends now.
The broadcast repeated, as all Harrow broadcasts did, cycling through every communication frequency in the galaxy. Every species would hear it. Every civilization that had surrendered or been destroyed would know that the Harrow had finally turned their attention to the quiet, patient, unsettling species that had done nothing while the galaxy burned.
Around Thessar, the Tessari refugees began to weep.
But Thessar did not weep. He remembered Captain Okonko's words, waiting for them to broadcast their victory. He turned and ran toward the observation deck. What he saw there made him stop breathing. The darkness of space was alive with motion. Ships were emerging from positions throughout the Sol system, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. They uncloaked from asteroid fields. They powered up from what had appeared to be dead moons. They rose from the surfaces of planets that had seemed uninhabited. And they were not small. Thessar had studied human naval architecture. Their vessels were supposed to be compact, functional, designed for efficiency rather than power. What he was seeing now bore no resemblance to those reports. These ships were vast, their hulls covered in weapons systems that looked almost organic in their complexity. They moved in perfect synchronization, flowing into formations that seemed to have been choreographed centuries in advance. Captain Okonkwo appeared beside him. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes that had not been there before.
Anticipation. Admiral, she said, I think you should hear this.
She activated her communicator, and a voice filled the observation deck. A human voice speaking with the quiet authority of absolute certainty.
This is Fleet Admiral James Kipritich of the United Human Defensive Coalition. The following message is being transmitted to all Harrow vessels and all civilizations capable of receiving. Thessar listened. He could not look away from the viewport, from the impossible sight of humanity's true fleet assembling in perfect order, but he listened with every fiber of his being. For 6 months, we have watched the Harrow consume the galaxy. We have observed your tactics, your logistics, your decision-making patterns. We have analyzed every broadcast you transmitted, every communication you sent, every resource allocation you made. You believe you are predators. You believe the galaxy belongs to those who are willing to take it. The human fleet began to move, not toward defensive positions, toward the approaching Harrow. You are wrong. We are humanity. We learned to survive when our own world tried to kill us. We learned to endure when our own species tried to destroy itself. We learned to wait when every instinct screamed at us to act, because we understood that patience is the greatest weapon in the universe. You broadcast your victory. You announced to every living being that you had won, that humanity would fall, that the silence of our species was evidence of our weakness. Thessar felt tears streaming down his face, though he could not have said whether they were grief or awe. It was not weakness. It was preparation. The human fleet engaged. What followed could not be called a battle. Battles implied some uncertainty about the outcome. Battles implied that both sides had a chance. What Thessar witnessed was the systematic, methodical, almost surgical dismantling of the largest military force the galaxy had ever seen by a species that had apparently been waiting 12,000 years for exactly this moment. The Harrow fleet outnumbered the human fleet 3-1. By conventional metrics, they should have overwhelmed the defenders within hours. Instead, they died. Human vessels moved through Harrow formations with impossible precision, their weapon systems targeting critical nodes that the Tasari had never identified. When Harrow ships tried to retreat, they found their exit vectors blocked by vessels that had been positioned months ago. When they tried to communicate, they discovered that their networks had been compromised, their coordination reduced to chaos. And through it all, the humans remained calm. Thesser watched their communications networks. Captain Okonkwo had granted him access, and what he heard was not the frantic shouting of warriors in combat. It was the quiet, professional exchange of information between specialists performing a task they had trained for their entire lives.
Sector 7 clear. Moving to Sector 8.
Confirmed. Cover fire from the Johannesburg.
Medical team to Bay 4. We have wounded incoming.
Admiral, the enemy flagship is attempting to retreat. Should we pursue?
Negative. Let them broadcast. Let them broadcast.
The Tsar understood. He finally completely understood.
The Harrow had built their empire on fear. They had used their broadcasts to paralyze resistance, to convince species that fighting was pointless. Every victory they announced was a weapon designed to break the spirit of their next target before the first shot was fired.
And humanity had turned that weapon against them.
They wanted the galaxy to watch, Captain Okonkwo said, her voice soft. So we're giving them something to watch.
The battle lasted 18 hours.
At the end of it, 12,000 Harrow vessels had been reduced to debris fields and drifting hulks. The human fleet had lost 700 ships, a fraction of their total strength, and was already beginning recovery operations for survivors.
And the Harrow's broadcast network, which had transmitted their victories for months, now carried a different message.
Thesar watched the transmission from the observation deck, surrounded by Tasari refugees who had gathered to witness something. They weren't sure what. Hope, perhaps, or vengeance, or simply proof that the universe had not completely abandoned them.
Fleet Admiral James Kipritich appeared on screen. He was an older man, his dark skin lined with age, his eyes carrying a weight that Thesser recognized, the weight of command, the weight of being responsible for the survival of billions.
To all species receiving this transmission, he said, the Harrow fleet that threatened the Sol system has been neutralized. We are now broadcasting on their network because we want the galaxy to understand something.
He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. Harder, more certain. For 6 months, the Harrow broadcast their victories. They showed you worlds burning. They showed you species dying. They wanted you to believe that resistance was impossible, that the only choice was submission or extinction.
They were wrong.
Humanity survived not because we were stronger than the threats we faced. We survived because we never stopped believing that survival was possible. We fought our own world when it tried to kill us. We fought our own nature when it tried to destroy us. We fought the silence of the universe when it seemed to prove that we were alone and meaningless.
And we won.
Not because we are special, not because we are chosen, but because we refused absolutely and completely to accept that the story was over. The transmission shifted, showing tactical displays, fleet movements, coordinates. We are now deploying assets to every territory occupied by the Harrow.
We are offering assistance to every species that has suffered under their aggression. We are not asking for anything in return. We are not seeking empire or dominance or gratitude.
We are doing this because it is right. Because no species should face extinction alone. Because the universe does not care whether you survive, but we do.
Admiral Kiprotich's face returned to the screen, and he smiled.
The Harrow broadcast their victory. Humanity ended it.
Now we begin again. 3 months later, Thesser von Keth stood on the bridge of a human vessel named the Second Dawn. Through the viewport, he could see Teshar Prime, not the burned husk that the Harrow had left behind, but something new. Human engineering teams had worked with Teshari survivors to begin the impossible task of restoration. The scars would remain for centuries, but life would return. Beside him, Captain Amara Okonkwo watched the terraforming drones begin their work.
You saved us, Thesser said. Not just our lives, our future. Everything we were, everything we might become, it exists because you chose to act.
The captain shook her head. We didn't save you, Admiral. We gave you the chance to save yourselves. There's a difference. It does not feel like a difference. Maybe not, but it matters. She turned to look at him, and her calm had shifted into something warmer, more human. The Tessari built an incredible civilization. 11,000 years of learning and growing and becoming more than you started as. We didn't do that. You did. All we did was protect the space you needed to keep going. Why? Because we know what it's like to almost lose everything. Because we've been there, Admiral, standing at the edge of extinction, wondering if our story was over. And we know that sometimes the only thing that keeps you going is the belief that someone, somewhere, gives a damn whether you make it. She smiled. We give a damn. That's all. That's everything. Thesser felt something move in his chest. Not grief, not anymore. Something else. Something that felt almost like hope, but deeper, more profound. Captain, he said, my people were ancient when humanity was young. We believed we understood the universe. We believed we had transcended the struggles that defined lesser species. We looked at your people and saw primitives, dangerous certainly, but ultimately irrelevant. I know. We were fools. No? Captain Okonkwo's voice was gentle. You were what your history made you, a species that succeeded so completely that you forgot what struggling felt like. That's not foolishness. That's just the price of paradise. She turned back to the viewport, to the sight of a dead world beginning to breathe again. Humanity paid a different price. We never got paradise. We got war and disease and climate collapse and the constant grinding awareness that everything we built could be taken away in an instant. It broke us, Admiral. It broke us over and over and over again. But you survived. Yes, we survived. And every time we survived, we got a little stronger. A little more patient, a little more certain that the next catastrophe wouldn't be the one that finally destroyed us. She paused. The Harrow thought our silence meant fear. They thought our patience meant weakness. They thought they understood us because they'd conquered 100 other species, and we seemed no different. But you were different. We were. Because we weren't waiting out of fear. We were waiting because we knew. We knew in our bones, in our history, in every story we'd ever told about ourselves, that the right moment would come. And when it did, we would be ready. And you were. Yes, we were. Thesser von Keth lived for another 400 years.
He watched the Tasari civilization rebuild from the ashes of its near extinction. He watched his people learn new lessons, humility, gratitude, the understanding that even the mightiest could fall and the fallen could rise again. He watched them forge new relationships with humanity, partnerships built on mutual respect rather than condescension. And he watched humanity continue to be humanity. They never claimed dominion over the galaxy. They never demanded tribute or fealty from the species they had saved. They simply continued to exist in their strange, quiet way, watching, waiting, building, enduring. When crises arose, they responded with the same calm efficiency that had destroyed the Harrow. When peace returned, they retreated to their modest territory and resumed their patient observation of the cosmos.
But humanity cared.
And as long as humanity cared, as long as they watched from the shadows and prepared for the darkness and refused to accept that the story was over, there was hope.
On his deathbed, 912 years after his birth, Thesser von Keth spoke his final words to his great-great-granddaughter, a young woman who had never known the time before humanity saved their people.
"Remember," he said, "remember what they did for us. Not the power, not the weapons, not the victory. Remember why they did it."
Why, grandfather? He closed his eyes, and he saw Captain Okonkwo's face, her calm eyes, her gentle certainty.
Because they refused to let us die alone. Because in a universe that does not care, they chose to care anyway. He smiled. That is what it means to be human. That is why they will endure long after we are gone, because they understand something the rest of us forgot.
What?
That the only thing stronger than the darkness is the choice to carry light anyway. He died peacefully, surrounded by family, surrounded by hope. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, humanity watched. They were patient. They were ready. They would always be ready. Because they had learned through 10,000 years of suffering, through countless moments of near extinction, through every catastrophe that should have destroyed them but didn't, that survival was not a gift. It was a choice. And they would make that choice again and again, until the last star went dark. The Harrow had broadcast their victory. Humanity had ended it. And the galaxy would never forget.